Let's welcome Siri again.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, everyone. That's actually not a joke, as you can see. This poor child has the misfortune of having two designer parents who are currently suffering from massive creative block. So if you do have any ideas, and preferably not something that will be hijacked by a major international company, then please send them my way. So I'm going to start with a short story, actually. This is me. I'm 6 years old. I'm waiting at a crosswalk, and while I do that, I try to outsmart this stoplight. I push the button from various different angles so that the light will be fooled into thinking that there's tons of people waiting, and it will be stressed out, and it will switch faster. So already at this very tender age, I had quite a sort of deeply rooted belief in the potential sophistication of connected products. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. As was mentioned, I work at Spotify, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about today, actually. Instead, I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts on this shift that I've been seeing in technology and design, and how that's impacting all of us who work in UX. And this talk is based on my 12 years of working and studying in design. And while this is a personal story, I hope that it will resonate with all of you, because it very closely follows with the development in our industry right now. And we'll sort of look at how design is going full circle from being primarily physical to it losing its physical relevance due to the digital revolution, and to us returning to a state now where things are coming full circle and digital and physical are thought as one joint thing, basically. So we'll start by backing up all the way to 2005. I started out studying industrial design. I had this vague idea that it would let me get to draw and tape things together and do that for a living, and I thought that sounded pretty sweet. So back then, I would say I never really considered IT or sort of the digital industries to be something that I would work with. I felt very little connection at the time with people who were engaging with working in graphic design or web design. And I thought they were very different occupations, basically. And I would argue that they were at the time. In 2005, though, same year that I embarked on my industrial design studies, Jamer Hunt published this manifesto for post-industrial design. And in it, he was stating that, ironically enough, industrial design, the engine of planned obsolescence, is now obsolete. For where we used to produce durable goods, which weren't really that durable after all, except in our landfills, we will now circulate code, capacity, and connections. And this was a prediction that passed me by, probably for the better. According to this, industrial design was dead, and physical products were dead. So it was probably a good thing I didn't come across this then. Instead, I sort of walked into art school happily, thinking that I would just go on designing tangible objects. 2005 was also the year when this small design studio set up shop in London called Berg, that some of you might have heard of. And this tiny studio would later become really well known in the design community and beyond for their very forward-thinking work in the area of connected products. And one of their founders said on the topic of designing with so-called immaterials that where once in this industrial design was concerned with body, form, and finish, we now deal in behaviors, experiences, shifting context, and time. Body, form, and finish. That is in itself enough to keep you busy for an entire career, and that was indeed the career that I was imagining myself that I would have. And at this point, the sort of idea of connected product was still very nascent, and it was nothing really that was part of the industrial design curriculum. Still, I think some of what was happening out there in the world did seep in and impact how we thought about things in design school. So for my bachelor project, for example, I designed a digital piano because I was interested in how these mechanical artifacts were being replaced by digital ones. And yet, we ended up replicating their mechanical appearance in digital form. But it's digital. It could be anything you want it to be. It's kind of much like when early sort of industrial manufacturing processes were trying to mimic the way that, say, furniture had been produced using hand craftsmanship back in the day. I graduated in 2008, and I went to work at a design firm in Stockholm. The year before this, if you remember, the very first iPhone came out. And what happened then was that things started dematerializing. Things started turning into apps. They turned into services. And some of the physical devices that quickly became replaced were the calculator, for example, the alarm clock, the audio recorder, the camera. Everything sort of became absorbed by this monolith. And the way of differentiating phones previously, if you had a phone in the early 2000s, used to be through color and trim, or by having them slide open in interesting ways. Now, the power of the experience had very little to do with the sort of shape and the casing of the machine itself. If this didn't cause an identity crisis for industrial designers, it really should have had, because the things that we were in the business of designing, our entire work, that was literally disappearing. So what we had started witnessing back then was what Kevin Kelly, who's the founder of the magazine Wired, wrote about last year in his book, The Inevitable, in which he forecasts 12 technological trends that will shape the next 30 years or so. And a couple of things that he talks about in this book is how we're moving from fixed products to always upgrading services and subscriptions. And he talks about how access will continue to displace ownership. As he states here in this quote, as the networks deepen, they gradually displace matter with intelligence. I think the iPhone was both a really strong example of how this would start happening, but it was also a very strong enabler that sped up this development. But while all of this was going on, I was still designing this. I was rendering Chrome buttons. So as you might notice, I was kind of slow at catching on with what was happening. And the reason was that I really loved industrial design. I really loved the craft qualities of it. There's something really powerful with putting something physical into the world. But after maybe a couple of years working with this, I realized it was time for a change. And that rather than making things work really well to fit the hand, there was this entire field that was occupied with and concerned with making things fit really well for the human mind. And I found that thought very intriguing. That's why in 2011, I decided to do a master's in interaction design. 2011 is also the year when this famous and now often quoted essay was published by an investor named Mark Andreessen, who's former co-founder of Netscape. And it was a really apt way of describing how software was being used to transform whole industries. Today, it's a fact that a lot of the most interesting and successful companies out there don't really rely on physical assets. So one example would be Airbnb. It's not in their business of owning properties, nor does Uber, for example, operate based on maintaining their own car fleet. So while all of this was happening, we were having some good times at school up in the north of Sweden. And despite how dated this costume party picture looks, I think we were really starting to respond to what was happening in this world. And it really showed in some of the work that people were doing. There was a real urge to work with connected products, with full physical and service experiences, rather than just graphical interfaces. I think Berg, the small studio that I mentioned earlier, they remained one of the big influences, putting out stuff like these explorations done together with Google Creative Labs, where hardware and software were sort of fused together with the aim of creating more legible products, where the interface is really clear and easy to read instead of hidden, and as in most cases today. I took a similar approach in my thesis, looking at how we might create clearer ways of interacting with things. But I focused on library services particularly, and how we could make digital books more tangible and accessible throughout the city, and at the same time leverage the data trail of physical books to give them an additional layer of history and value to people. In 2014, I graduated and I went to work at IDEO in London. And here are some of my colleagues at the London office. Happy times. And at IDEO, I worked with those exact industries that Andreasen had stated were being eaten by software. So it was retail, it was gaming, real estate, education, and so on. Although what became really apparent when working on these type of projects was that even when the kind of core experience was primarily digital, the physical touch points became even more important and even more crucial to get right. One example is this conceptual project that I was involved in that we did for IKEA, where we communicated ideas around the future of food and cooking by designing out this full physical environment. And all parts of the concept really relied on services in some form, but the tactility was just as important to consider, if not even more so, especially because cooking is such a sensory experience. So after having been back and forth to the US a few times and having spent a couple of years in the UK, in 2016 I went to work at Spotify. And a big part of our R&D department sits in Stockholm, which is where I'm based. At the moment sorry. Didn't realize that was so offensive. And at the moment I'm entirely focused on exploring future possibilities for our mobile experience. So you could say that I've been moving further away from the physical realm, and that digital has in fact ended up eating my whole career by now. But even so, even with a pure digital and sort of service company such as Spotify, you can't help but notice a general tendency in the past few years of how smartphones and connected products are causing this sort of convergence of industrial design and interaction design. So now I want to reach the point in this talk that I've been wanting to get to. Because I think as the fields keep maturing, we'll essentially be able to choose what form things take. So we can kind of freely combine the best of digital and physical. And I think some products that have traditionally been physical, it makes perfect sense to dematerialize them into an app. But others that might have been locked behind the screen until now could benefit from extending into the physical world. And we actually have a choice now of how we want it. The nice thing is that all the principles of good design are quite independent of medium, which means as a designer, moving between is not as hard as it first might seem. And I have a couple of examples of this. Remember how I earlier mentioned that this used to be a main differentiator for phones, how they slid open, basically. And see how intrigued Keanu Reeves is by this beautiful hinge. From the world of industrial design, we know that every hinge you introduce in a product, it introduces a weak point, a potential break point. But if you get them right, they will not only enhance the functionality often, but also the overall impression of the product. The same thing goes for digital products. As you saw in a lot of the very nice animation examples that Stefan showed earlier. But in digital, we talk about it as transitions. And that is why we in UX tend to think of our work in terms of flows, and we spend a lot of effort and focus on the connection between states rather than just the fixed states themselves. And it makes time itself a sort of design material. And you can enhance an object through the way in which it moves between these states. The same goes for physical as well as digital. Another example is what I've here chosen to call seams. And consciously working with seams in design means designing so that users can easily perceive the capabilities of a system as well as the limitations. And it's about creating really clear affordances. The simplest example that I could think of is the case of these salt and pepper grinders, which have a very minimalistic design, and the only giveaway of the how you use this really is the split line, which hopefully tells the user something about how these different parts can twist around each other, around an axis. And in digital design, there's often not much reason to show off this theme. We like to think of experiences as being seamless. It's something you strive for example, like in this Lyft car ride app that reads your calendar and second guesses where you want to go. It makes everything very seamless. You don't even have to type in an address. Sometimes, though, showing more than what is necessary can actually be very helpful of the underlying system. Here's a case of the autonomous cars that I'm sure all of you have heard about recently. This is a self-driving service for Uber. And it has a screen monitor that's placed kind of between the driver and like next to the driver, so that it's facing the people in the back seat. And it reveals to the rider what the car is seeing, essentially. It shows what's going on in the background to ensure people that the system is working, because this relies very much on trust in the system. And as you can probably figure out, this is not actually what the car is seeing. That is much more complex. It's taking in so many other signals. But the scenes in this case have been carefully designed out to just show enough that it will instill trust in the system. We used to be in this place where digital products, in an attempt to be made more understandable, tried to mimic physical things that were assumed to be more familiar to us. You might have heard the term of skeuomorphism to describe this. Now we've reached a state where, to a very high degree, it's the other way around. Physical objects are becoming inspired by the properties of digital things. And I'll share some examples. We'll see in the case of products that are leaning very heavy on a service layer, like these two, they're both intended to help you with to manage your medication. The one on the left here is called GlowCap and has been around for a few years now. And it alerts you to take your medicine, and you can even order refills from your local pharmacy through a little feature in the lid. The picture on the right here is from a company called PillPack, and it's a service that sorts your medicine for you by time of day and like for every weekday, and it delivers it to your door. So it's highly physical, but the physical product is just one interface of several to the service. Because the proposition at its core is really the service, and it relies on a really well thought through UX. And the form in which these pills are delivered would not have been possible had it not been for the digital layer that sits underneath. We find another example in the area that I worked with when I first joined Spotify a couple of years ago, speakers. Wi-Fi speakers, I don't know how many of you have them at home already, but they're increasingly sort of trying to blend into our home environments. Form is still important, but it's not the key differentiator anymore. What's interesting here is that both these products look the way they do, partly because of the services that they rely on. I have both of these at home because I had to bring them home to test them, and they, by some chance, ended up staying in my home because they were nice to have around. But the difference between these two is that the Sonos, this one, I hardly ever touch. It just sits there on the shelf. They've intentionally made the physical aspects of it so that the controls are very minimal. And the result is that I only interface with it through the companion app on my phone. The Urban Ears one, though, which is this one, has two little physical knobs on it. And that's how I end up turning this on and off. I adjust the volume using this, and I even use it for presets that I've been able to select myself to get certain music going. And the digital here is given this physical representation where it has been sensed to do so. And it means that I don't have to go to my phone and use that as a universal remote. There's this nice sort of haptic feedback and sort of physicality that has been brought back, where for a while it wasn't thought of as being needed at all. And you don't really need it. You could do everything on your phone, but guess which one of these models that I prefer and that I use the most? Another case that I want to bring up where digital has potential to shape the physical is that of wear. As you might have considered in the past, the value of an object is often revealed through the daily use. And that's very much true for software. Wearing in software means that it starts adapting to you, it gets to know you, it molds to your behavior in the way that Spotify hopefully gets to know you better and better and gives you better suggestions of what to listen to over time. Or the way that Amazon seems to know when you need to restock on tissue paper. Every time you carry out an action in the app, it's a signal that can be interpreted and used to make a better informed guess. And we're expecting this already from most of our digital products. But when we will come to expect the same of our physical goods? The image here on the right is a design concept by IDEO, made for the purpose of an exhibition, so it doesn't exist yet. But once you've worn out these sneakers, the idea is that you simply bag them up and you send them back to the factory, where the sole is scanned and the materials are then disassembled and processed for reuse. The factory can then use the scan of the sole to print a new shoe using the reclaimed materials, and it will be perfectly tailored to you. So it comes back a slightly improved version, just like an algorithm-based playlist would. And this shoes concept is an example of circular economy. Circularity is an alternative way of thinking of business by imagining a product as a service that feeds materials and knowledge back into the system. And it's an important concept for thinking of how the digital shapes the physical. The centennial bulb here is the longest burning bulb in the world. It's been going for over 100 years now. But it's an exception. Light bulbs have for long been like a disposable product. That's changing now with the LED technology. And from a business point of view, there's always been this sort of flaw in the LED model where, like, what do you do if you're a manufacturer and you can't sell more light bulbs? Because your product will last for decades, essentially. Does the durability of the product start inhibiting the business? Some of you might have heard of Philips Paper Lux, which is this image here. And it introduces light as a service. Customers aren't buying the bulbs or the tubes anymore. They're just buying light. And through this intelligent system, Philips ends up having greater control over the fixtures they produce, the energy and the materials. It's easier for them to do maintenance and recover materials in the end. So it becomes in their interest to save energy while keeping the client happy with the service. So circular thinking results in reasons for manufacturers to want their product to be really long-lived and take control over the full life cycle of the product. And I think this will give industrial designers new opportunities to shift their focus and apply their skills in new ways instead of focusing on obsolescence and making seasonal updates all the time. It might become more important for a product to be possible to co-own by several people across its lifetime, or that a piece of packaging can be refilled in an easy way when it's empty. And I think if circularity becomes important in our lifetime, it's going to be because people really find more value in the product. It's not just going to be because they like the sustainability idea. It's going to be because the products are actually better, and the services associated are going to be better. So I want to end on this positive note by saying that it's going to be important for many of us in UX to have one foot in each world going forward. And there's an excellent book called Understanding Industrial Design that I think you should all pick up. And in it, the authors state that the best designers today demonstrate a hybrid depth with skills that overlap multiple disciplines. What does that hybrid depth mean? Well, I think there are things both disciplines need to do to adapt to this new reality of design. Industrial design needs to become better at understanding complex systems with multiple actors and product development cycles that don't just stop when the goods leave the factory. And they need to think about the service layer and how it can add to existing products and also enable brand new ones. And meanwhile, we in interaction and UX, we need to start embracing physical and spatial possibilities more than we do today, and we need to dare to expand beyond the screen to start engaging the full range of our human senses. Thank you.
Thank you, Siri, for sharing the story. Let's go straight to audience questions. Questions to Siri. If not, then, well, I actually had one. This was a story about how software has eaten your world, right? So you had a background in industrial, and yet your career has been shifting to digital. So to the youth of today, well, I'll preface this by saying, like, some of the best digital designers I know actually have an industrial design background, because that education forces you to think about constraints and materials and production in a way that's actually useful for digital. So for the youth of today, would you advise to study industrial design and then move to digital, or just skip all that stuff and go straight to digital? Or is that even a real choice these days?
I would encourage industrial design programs to become more adapted to this new way, and acknowledge that a lot of people who go into industrial design are going to end up designing services and digital products in the end. I wouldn't say it's a good start for going into UX necessarily, but I think it will be a crucial skill in the future, and I'm already seeing this in my own work. We don't have any industrial designers hired at Spotify, but we keep coming across hardware products in different ways, where it does become really important to sort of really understand the context that users find themselves in when they're interacting with something, the sort of environmental constraints that they have, for example, when they're in a car or when they're in the kitchen at home, so on. And so, yeah, is that a good answer?
Yes, thank you. More questions? Stefan.
Hi. Oh, awesome. So my question is, can digital designers learn from industrial designers to create more emotional experiences? Because you mentioned like materials, those knobs and everything, which are, I think, purely emotional. You don't necessarily need them.
Exactly, yeah. And I think maybe in a way, like, UX as a field has been very, like you touched on, like, it's been so utilitarian for so long that a lot of us might have lost that emotional connection. Whereas in industrial design, that has been such a big, it's been so important for differentiation for so long, that I definitely think there are things you can pick up on it and apply to digital products for sure. When it just comes to the delight and to the sort of general happiness that we can give to the users. Yeah. Okay. I can point you to some resources later as well, if you're interested.
One more question, if somebody has anything. If not, then thank you, Siri and Stefan. And this is the end of our second block.